Welcome back to Inverted Aviators RC. The last time I flew the 1.2 meter Corsair, I landed it like FedEx delivers packages, hard and fast, and because of that, I've got two gears that point outwards, and we've got to fix that so it flies nicely. So the first step is actually removing the gear itself from the plastic housing, and that just requires a few screws, one in each corner, and then once you have it removed, cut away any of the extra foam that might be sticking to this plastic housing so that when you eventually hot glue it back together, you have the maximum amount of contact in between the housing itself and the foam. As you can see, line up the housing with the opening facing the back towards those wheel wells, because that's the way the gear will fold down. And then just apply a little bit of hot glue on the outside. You can be generous with it because this is going to be how your plane lands, so a little extra glue is no issue. But once you get it all pressed in, take an extra piece of foam and wipe away any of the excess glue just so it looks nice and there's a nice hot glue seal rather than a bunch of globs and extra pieces of hot glue all around. And once it's back in, you can use the gear itself to apply pressure all around the housing, and that will just make sure everything is stuck in really nicely. And then go back with a second layer of hot glue on the outside to kind of seal in the edges of that housing. Again, just trying to strengthen and make the gear as strong as possible. And again, use another piece of foam to wipe it all up, and just like that, you should have a newly glued in housing. Now the second gear is a little more fun because not only does it not work, but it's also busted up and bent to the side quite a bit, and the wheel itself isn't spinning because it's kind of bent on this pinion gear that it's sitting on. But the same process, luckily it's not completely ripped out of the housing, so just take a few screws out and inspect it and see, golly, it's pretty wrecked. So you're gonna have to take off the little plastic protection piece on the gear in order to actually re-bend that straight metal piece. So there's just a few screws on the base of it, really straightforward there. And then you're going to need to find a pliers or a little tweezers to remove this holding pin, and that keeps the tire on and keeps it freely spinning. And you can see me shuffling through different pieces of equipment and tools because it's pretty difficult to get this little pin out, but eventually the wheel will just slide off. Really simple. And then you need to bend this back. It's supposed to be straight, and you can clearly see it's not. And I tried to just use brute force, and it's a pretty strong piece, which means I landed it really hard. And so I got a monkey wrench and I wrapped it in this cloth to protect the gear from any marring that could come from this wrench. And it turns out it worked really, really well. So just a pro tip, wrap your plastic in cloth before using any metal tools to prevent it from scraping it up. And just like that, we have a straight gear. Now I just thought, no big deal. I'll just use the monkey wrench straight on the plastic, and it actually does mar it up, believe it or not. So I'll show it here in a second, but I do kind of scrape it up. But it's really no big deal. It's on the gear, but just showing what'll happen if you don't protect your pieces before you use metal tools on them. And then a quick reassembly, just put the wheel back on the metal piece or on the gear itself. I'd reattach that little C gear, and now we have some rolling gears, which is really nice. So just got to screw back on that little protective blue piece onto one of the gears. The other one doesn't have it because it must have broken off, but we'll have a gear that's looking nice. And next we're on to the aileron. Now the fun part about these ailerons is that they use nylon gears inside of the little gearbox, and when I crashed, both the aileron and the flap servo stripped out a few of the teeth on the gears, which caused it to like click, and you'll see it later when I'm going over how to fix the flap. But the first step in fixing it is actually cutting it out, and E-flite does a great job of gluing these servos in really, really well. So you're gonna have to take a little bit of time, use an X-Acto knife and maybe even a flathead screwdriver, and be careful not to mar up the foam around the servo. But once you cut it out, the next step is finding a different gear, because in my case I inspected it and the top gear just was missing a few teeth. And there's some 9-gram servos, which I will link in the description, but they have the exact same gears, or at least very, very close, to a point where you can just replace broken gears, which is really handy. And so all I did was take apart a 9-gram servo and replace the top gear. And you might be thinking, why not just use that blue servo? Why are we swapping gears? But that's because the black servo is actually a reversed servo, and then there's probably a way to reverse one of those blue servos, but I actually tried to fix it that way, and I cut out all that film from this video because it didn't work and it was broken completely. So instead of doing that, you can just swap the gears. It makes it really nice, and I think you'll be able to see here, the gear's starting to spin and it's working. which is really nice. So I think these 9-gram servos are really cheap, and if you just need a quick fix to a broken or a spinning / choppy / not working gear, that is the way to do it. And just one thing to keep in mind as you're shuffling gears between the original black servo and one of your new 9-gram servos is to always have every gear that should be there. As you just saw, that I was missing a gear, which was causing the whole servo to just spin constantly, and after adding in the top gear and one of the middle gears back, it's working all as it should. So after you have the replacement gear all set up, you can just click the top casing and the bottom casing back in and screw it back in, and you should be good to go. Next step is just hot gluing the servo back in. Again, relatively easy. Just make sure that you have the servo exactly perpendicular to that linkage arm so that the whole motion will move smoothly. And once you get the linkage arm all screwed in, give it one more final test to make sure there's none of that ratcheting or that choppiness, and you should be good to go to move on. Now luckily for us, the flap was having pretty much the exact same issue as the aileron. As you can see, as I turn it up, the left flap on the screen will get really choppy near the top, and that's not good. But that's because the nylon gear is stripped out, just like the aileron, so the fix should be relatively similar. And so thankfully it was only one flap and not both of them, but that's because I landed hard on that one side, so that's why the aileron and the flap are both a little goofed up. But the process will be exactly the same, except this time I'm going to cut out the flap servo, which was a little more embedded than the aileron servo. So again, just be careful with the X-Acto knife. It is a knife, so just take all precautions necessary and use tweezers or a flathead screwdriver to take off that servo. You're also going to need to unscrew the linkage arm just to make sure that servo can move freely. Keep track of that screw because it is very important to make sure your flap is working as it should. But it will take a while to cut it out because, again, these servos are glued in really well. So just cut along the outside as much as you can and then try to dig underneath it to get the whole thing popped out. And after quite a bit of struggling, you can see I just jimmied in a screwdriver and popped that thing out. And so use that X-Acto knife to shave off all this extra foam and extra bits that are on this servo because it will hurt the hot glue sticking to the servo and then eventually back into the wing itself. So just make sure you got a nice clean shave before gluing that thing back in, and then we can move on to the next step of fixing up this servo, which will be removing the 4 screws and taking the whole servo apart. This process, again, just like the aileron, so we're going to take everything out and then take off the top gear because that is where the issue is. We've got a stripped off top gear. Now, the fun part about having 2 servos with the exact same issue with different gears is that I used the same servo to replace the top gear in the servo, or the top gear in the flap servo, as well as the middle gear in the aileron servo. So instead of replacing 2 servos completely, I used one to fix 2. So that was really nice. And so all you have to do is take it apart, figure out which gear isn't working, and you will end up with a busted up blue servo, but you can actually use that blue servo for one of the LED switches that I've made a video about. So reduce, reuse, recycle, use all of your parts as much as you can because there's always useful components no matter how broken you think it is. Now you see me struggling here to get this top gear back on, and while these gears do fit, they are from different companies, so they're just a little bit different. But just be careful to push the nylon gears on because they could break. But once they get on, it's pretty easy to just snap that top back together, screw it all back in, and then pop it back into the wing to see that everything is still working just as it should. And as you can see with this little test, the servo should be working just as it should, which is really nice because I really like the flaps. And as long as you set up the linkage arm to be exactly along with the other flap to make sure both flaps work at the same time, you should be good to go. So just like the aileron, hot gluing back in the servo is super easy. Just make sure it is exactly perpendicular with that linkage arm and you should be good to go. Another thing is cable management. wiring or routing these wires back in will require a little bit of patience because you want it to be exactly in that channel, and it's totally okay to cut those channels a little bit wider. And if you have that servo tape sitting around, it's really easy to hot glue the servo tape back on. Now this is the fun part. Once everything is back and working, just kind of setting it back, reattaching everything, screwing the gears back in. So you're just going to take the gears, screw them back into those plastic housings that we hot glued into the plane earlier, and it's actually easier to retract the gears to screw things in and then bring them back out, because certain screws are covered by the gear when they're completely down, but it's a relatively easy process of screwing everything back in. And then once again, cable management is really important because you have 6 wires coming from the wing back into the cockpit, and just making sure everything is connected up really nice is just, it's going to help you down the road. So if you have zip ties or little Velcro straps to keep everything connected and tight together, that will be your friend. But as you can see, one final test, ailerons are working just as they should, and I connect the flaps here, or the gear, excuse me, it's working just fine. That other gear doesn't work at all, so that's no big deal, but all of the control surfaces are working just as we should. So final reassembly, I've done this in a few different videos of just putting everything back together, but it's a matter of fishing all of these wires up through that little gap in the main fuselage of the plane, which can be annoying, but again, if you have zip ties or Velcro straps, that'll make your process a lot easier. And then it's just a matter of 4 screws on the bottom, and your plane should be back good to go. And if you made it this far into this repair video, we'd really appreciate a like and subscribe because it helps the channel grow. But also, this video wasn't as simple as I made it look. This actually was cut down from about 4 hours of trying to fix this plane up because I kept trying to resolder different servos and switch around wires, and I was really trying to get technical with it and make it look really nice, and I think it did look really nice in the end, but unfortunately it did take quite a long time. And so after this plane is all good and ready to go, I've got a little montage of me getting frustrated and upset at this plane because I think it's kind of fun to see both how it actually works and then the behind the scenes of me being like, wow, I'm really struggling. So just know that everything wasn't super smooth and I make a ton of mistakes. So please enjoy this little montage of me being really, really confused about why this sucker doesn't work. What is going on? Screw in. How can I be screwing in for so long? Why isn't this working?